This presentation is by Jodelle Onstadt. Jodelle Onstadt is a socio-biblical and historical research specialist whose work focuses on comparative biblical and ancient Near Eastern studies. She's the author of 5 books. In addition to archaeological and biblical studies, Jodelle's research reveals value-based principles that relate to politics and economics today. Jodelle is a successful author, entrepreneur, business owner, and public speaker. She's a frequent guest on the Jeff, how does he say his name? Career Show in New Orleans, Dove TV in Eugene, Oregon, and the morning show on Hebrew Radio Nation. Jodelle's first book, Yahweh Exists, if I can lift it. And I've read it, by the way. Volumes 1 and 2 comprises 17 years of groundbreaking research charting the archaeological, historical, and religious tenets for ancient Israel and its implications for Judaism and Christianity. Do you have any with you, or?
Yes, I do.
Okay, there are some books available. Maybe you can put them out, or people just talk to Jodelle. And her research has demonstrated that Scripture contains an actual and factual history that can be tested against history and chronology from other ancient nations. Jodelle, thank you.
Good morning. So I hope everybody got this really teeny tiny printed worksheet. So yes, you didn't know that you were going to have an eye exam this morning, but you might want to invest in higher power reading glasses. So I'm going to walk around just a little bit. I like to move around. So what I wanted to share with you guys this morning is chronology. So the oxymoron perhaps in this is that I am really terrible at math, which means I have to work really, really hard at anything mathematically related. And I have become very passionate about chronology and how chronology really sheds light on an ancient world. And I find that so many different times when it comes to religion, so many religious organizations, movements want to look at all of these alternate ways for understanding truth, for getting to know God. So whether you look at mysticism, numerology, hidden codes, hidden textual, whether it's numbers or repeating letters, there's always some hidden ideology whereby you come to know the secrets of God. But what we find in the Hebrew text more or less contradicts those ideas, because what you find is this emphasis over and over again that Yahweh has plainly revealed himself to Israel. You find in Isaiah 46, 9 through 10, and let me just say, it's amazing how much James's study, as well as Dave Tyler's study, we all kind of converge as we travel along the same path. So it's just amazing how you see the text and it leads you in the same path. And so Isaiah tells us, he says, remember the former things of old. I am Yehovah, there is none else. I am Elohim, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and ancient times from the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do my pleasure. So here is Isaiah living around 720 BCE, and he's saying, remember these ancient times, remember the beginning. Well, Joshua also tells us to remember the beginning. Here's Joshua, I dated right around 1500 BCE, who tells us in Joshua 24, verse 2, look to old time. Look before to Terah your father, at the time of Abraham. I mean, he's talking about 600 years prior. And he's saying, look to these older times for truth. You also have this idea of Yehovah being this really great fortune teller, telling Israel's ancient history, past, present, and future of the things that will occur in her history. Isaiah 48, verses 3 through 5. Isaiah tells us, I have declared you the former things from the beginning. They went forth out of my mouth. I showed them. I did them suddenly, and they came to pass. Because I knew that you are obstinate, and I knew that your neck is an iron sinew, and that your brow is brass. I have told you from the beginning. I have declared it before you. Before things come to pass, I showed it to you. And then skipping down, Isaiah says, I have not spoken in secret from the beginning. From the time that it was, there I am. So we have this idea that from the beginning, the world had a lot of truth. Now, what I found is that chronology actually sheds light. I mean, again, we don't need any hidden codes. We don't need any secret formulas. But if you look at chronology, there is actually a lot of truth that is given to us there. So if you will bring out your little teeny tiny sheet, we are going to go over and through some of the observations that we can learn through this history. So the first thing that I found when I was looking at this chronology is that the concept of time, this is going to be the very first line, and this would have been like 4000 BCE. Time did not exist and begin to exist until outside the garden. So once there is sin, once there is change, that is when modern time begins. That's when Adam starts living. It's also when he starts dying outside the garden. You also have, there are only about 1,666 years from Adam until the flood. And you also have this idea of the Tower of Babel. Did you ever think it was possible to know when the Tower of Babel was destroyed? When you look at numbers, you look at anomalies. And there's one anomaly that stands out after the flood. And that is 341 years after the flood. You have 3 patriarchs that in different generations, they all die at the same time. These are the first generations after the flood to die, period, according to the Masoretic text. Now, let me just say, the Septuagint gives a differing chronology. The numbers are much larger. I have opted for the Masoretic text simply because in studying the various manuscripts and the various scholarship, I do find the Masoretic text to be a more solid document, especially as you come into the United Kingdom era. But even for the more ancient times, I find the Masoretic text more cogent. So we can date the destruction of the Tower of Babel right around 2000 BCE. This would conflict with what we know of Egyptian chronology. Maybe something could be shed light on it. But at this point in time, I am strictly looking at what the text says. What can we find from the text? There's also other interesting things that we can glean from the text. You have the Hebrew in the Tower of Babel was destroyed during the lifetime of Peleg. His name means earthshaker. We also have a sort of coincidental name that occurs in Greek mythology. Have you guys ever heard of Poseidon? His name also means storms, earth shaker, and it's kind of this cogency between these ideas and concepts. But what I want to stress in this, and this to me is what was so neat, when we look at the idea of could truth be preserved, could truth be disseminated, and could it last? Say from the time of Adam through the time of Noah to the time of Abraham, I want to share with you the fact that it was actually very easy for truth to be maintained. One thing that's interesting in the story of Genesis, whether you look at Genesis 26, Genesis 18, where it talks about Abraham having Yahweh's statutes, his judgments, his laws. It says that Abraham had it. Never does it say that Yahweh gave it to him. We have the giving of the covenant, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. But never are we told that Abraham had it, or rather that Yahweh gave it to Abraham. He simply had it. So the question for me became, how did Abraham have it if he had the statutes, judgments, and laws? Well, I want to show you that chronology sheds a great bit of light, and for me, it makes it come alive. So look at your, and I put this in yellow. If you look at your sheet, Abraham dies, no, Adam dies in 3071 BCE. From his life, during his lifetime, Methuselah is living. Methuselah had lived for 243 years with Adam. Methuselah lives all the way to the time of Noah. And then he dies the year of the flood. Noah lives all the way until Abraham is 58 years of age. I mean, do you know that to me that cogency, that overlap, I had never been taught that. But when you do the numbers, this is the way that the math works out. So you have 3 generations from Adam to Abraham. These are living generations and lifespans. So Adam lives through Methuselah's day, Methuselah lives until Noah's days, and then you have Noah who lives until Abraham's days. Now Shem, okay, this is really, really cool. Guess what? Shem lives until Jacob and Esau are around 50 years of age. Isn't that amazing? So when you look at, when you deal with questions of validity, and, in my discussions, my talk, my interactions with people, I deal with a lot of atheists, a lot of agnostics. So, well, what about this myth that is similar to the Bible? And what about this myth that's similar to the Bible? Well, when you're dealing with this short history and you have a forum where people live very, very lifespans, there is actually a mechanism to transmit truth. So at this early stage, it really doesn't matter whether a proto-Torah or whatever they had in the beginning, whether it was written or not, because you had these very long lifespans that provided stability. You had these people that could keep things in check. And so now let's take this to something that becomes relevant. You have similar stories. They are not in any way the same story. There's a lot of myth. But ancient nations such as Mesopotamia, even Egypt, and you even have some in the Aztecs, where they have some stories about creation. They have some stories about the tree of life. They also have a flood. We call these foundation myths. But there are certain parallels with the Hebrew text. Well, if we look at there actually being a common history, these things actually happened. It's not just myth. There's actually history here. You have other nations that took this history and mythologized it. So they spun it to support their institutions that grew up. And these institutions grew up and they had to be supported. And so you tell these stories that empower them and make them larger than life. The Hebrew text is different because you don't find that mythology with the Hebrew text. It's something that's very plain, very, very historical. But when you're looking at the overlap, you do see that overlap. So when I'm looking at this, I look at what can I learn from this history and how can it bring the world to life. So the other thing that you find in this is the ideas of savior deities. Something that was a later development. You find some of that with the myths of Osiris. Eventually it comes into Tammuz. But when we question what truth did the ancient world have, you find that even in the Hebrew text, there's this idea, Exodus 4:22, Israel is Jehovah's firstborn son. And then you find in Deuteronomy 28 these ideas that Jehovah is going to persecute his firstborn son. The idea that if Israel disobeys, if Israel forgets the covenant, if she rebels against the covenant, there's all these curses that are going to chase Israel. And he says, until I destroy you. And they will be upon your seed forever until the idea is there, until we return to him. So you also find in other ancient nations the idea of the savior deities, that they die, they're resurrected, sometimes 3 days, sometimes 4 days. And of course you have in Hosea the idea that in the 3rd day, Jehovah will raise up Israel. So the idea is that I have found, and this is just my conclusion, is that when you look at the very early history, this in old time, If all the world had a truth at one point in time, and then it became corrupted, everybody started adding their own versions, everybody started spinning it in their own ways, this is where we see kind of strands of Torah going off in many, many different directions and at different points in time. Of course, the New Testament era takes it in a totally different direction, but you see this throughout history. So this brings us now down to the book of Job, which I'm going to skip forward because I've kind of given an overview of the past. So in my studies and working through the various scholarship, I am dating the book of Job right at about 1620, 1600, very, very early. I find that the book of Job predates Mount Sinai. And the reason of this is that the language is very, very fragmented. Some scholars say that it may have originally been written in a Proto-Edomite. And the book of Job is basically a parable of Israel. And it sheds a great amount of light on the Song of Moses, because Moses actually quotes from the book of Job. And it sheds a great deal of light also on Israel's history. And let me just share some of the overlap between Israel's history and the book of Job. So you find that during Job's affliction, he laments and he debates with Jehovah. But yet throughout Job's affliction, Jehovah hides his face from Job and he refuses to answer. Job realized, and this is a quote from Job 23:10, when Jehovah had tried him, he would come forth shining like gold. Now, who quotes from that? Isaiah, right. Now, Moses also builds on this concept. You also have the idea that persecution provoked Job to file a lawsuit against God, to demonstrate God's oversight in his affliction. You know, Job says over and over again, you know, hear my cause. You've ignored me. You have judged me unjustly. Look at me. And as God continues to hide his face and continues to ignore Job, Job claims that he had become a laughingstock, a byword, and a proverb among his people. Does that sound familiar? Deuteronomy 28. He finally asks for an arbitrator who would reconcile him to God. But yet through all this, God continues to hide his face until Elihu comes on the scene. And Elihu points out that God does not judge or afflict humanity without cause. And he points out that Jehovah is a righteous judge. Finally, when God answers Job, he reveals the reason for Job's suffering, allowing Job to see and understand Jehovah's righteousness. Now, if you'll pull out your little sheet, I just wanted to give you guys an overview and a context of who Job is. So this is debated, this is controversial, because in the Septuagint, it states that Job is listed in the Syriac version as Jobab. So what I did is I went through Genesis 36, where you have Edomite chronology, and you find that all the characters within the book of Job are actually listed in Genesis 36. Now, the names are rendered differently. This could be a translation issue. But you have Bildad listed as Bilhan. He would have been a descendant of Seir. You have Zephar, who's also listed as Zepho. And he would have been a descendant of both Eliphaz, so he would have been an Edomite. But he also would, on his mother's side, be a descendant from Seir. Eliphaz, I mean, the one name that we really translates the same in both texts, he was Esau's son. His city, it says that he built a city in the name of his son, Teman. That is listed in both Job as well as Genesis 36. The land of Uz, he was a descendant of Seir, also listed in Genesis 36:28. So then that brings us to Job. Job would have been a descendant of Esau on his father's side and a descendant of Ishmael on his mother's side. So this brings us back to the idea of the family of Abraham. In Genesis 18, Jehovah states, For I know Abraham, that he will teach his children and his household after him the way of Yahweh to do justice and judgment. Well, we think of this in the terms of the seed of Jacob. But this actually applies to a much broader group outside of the seed of Jacob. Because what you find when you go through the book of Job is you find this debate of theology between Job, Elihu, and the three friends, his cousins. This would have been his great uncle. This would have been his cousins. And you find that when is all said and done, Yahweh himself has a little judgment to pronounce. And at the end of the book, he says Eliphaz and his family members need to bring sacrifices because they did not speak that which was right in the eyes of Yahweh, as did Job. And what you find is that throughout the book, they're hurling all these false accusations against Job for the reasons of his suffering. But in this, when you go through the words, you also find a core of Edomite pagan theology. When you go through the words of Eliphaz and his three friends, the two that stand out are going to be Elihu and Job. You don't find the Edomite theology there. Remember, it says that when Esau began to marry the women of Canaan, it was a vexation and it was a point of contention for his parents. And the reason of this is because it comes through the theology that Esau's sons are adopting and what they are believing. So I put some verses on here that just show the cogency between the land of Uz and Job's heritage with Edom. The other thing that I want to point out in this is that when we look at the people in ancient scripture, whether we look at Jethro, the Midianite, Jethro had the ability to teach Moses how to apply Torah. He tells Moses, it's not good that you take all this load upon your shoulder. You need to share, you need to delegate. Well, how did Jethro, or Reuel as he's also mentioned, a high priest of Midian, how was he able to counsel Moses in the Torah? Well, Midian was also a descendant, and Nehemiah mentioned this. Midian is a descendant of Abraham. When it says he will teach his children and his household after him, Midian is a descendant of Abraham through Keturah, who Abraham took another wife after Sarah died. It was a concubine. And Midian was one of those heirs. So if his children, all the children of the concubines, had this love of Torah instilled in them, they had it in their children, and it was handed down to their children after them. So you find that in the ancient world, there was a great knowledge of Torah at one time. You have Melchizedek. Here, Abraham brings his tithes and his offerings with Sodom and Gomorrah to Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem. In Genesis 15, Yahweh says, I cannot yet destroy the Amorites. I cannot yet chase them out of the land because the sins of the Amorites have not yet come to the full. So there was righteousness in a very early point in time. But you find that as time progresses, as time goes on, it becomes more and more corrupt as people fall away from a knowledge of Torah. The other thing that happens is all the patriarchs, by the time you get to Jacob and their sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, all the patriarchs after the flood have died. You're now dying in the lifespan of your grandchildren. So you no longer have these very long lives to keep some sort of truth disseminated. So I want to encourage you when you read text, or maybe you come across something on the internet where it talks about maybe the Code of Hammurabi. Both the Torah and the Code of Hammurabi have this idea of eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Some of the laws that they deal with, whether it's theft, they deal with the same concepts, the same issues. Now you find the Torah is much more lenient, whereas the Hammurabi Code may exact 10 or 20 times the amount, may put you to death if you cannot repay. The Torah is only 5 or 6 times, so it's a much lenient code. But they both deal with ideas that are very, very relevant for their day. So there's some overlap in the concepts of what they deal with. So when you read this, just realize that there were a lot of people living at the same time where truth could have been disseminated. There was stability. And I also want to put it to you that it's not in a secret code or some hidden path that you find truth, but it's actually rudimentary scholarship, sticking with the text, and you find a very plain path. And that is how this veil cast over the nations will be lifted. You know, I look at so many of us with United Israel World Union, each and every one of us, we're like veil lifters. You know, we're not holding up some platform, we're not holding up some contrived idea of doctrine whereby there's a preordained establishment and we're going to step on toes. You know, most of us are quite comfortable stepping on toes. You know, we dance the dance, and no matter who toes we step on, it's all about the text. So anyways, I just wanted to share this with you. Some of this will be in my forthcoming book, Volume 2. But others of it is in a chronology book that I will be publishing. It's already written. And it goes basically from Adam through the divided kingdom era and shows cogency with Sumerian tablets and King's List and everything. One other point to mention real quick. The other thing that you find in ancient Mesopotamia, a Sumerian King's List, where the antediluvial kings lived very, very long lives. Now, their numbers are far inflated. Yeah, 10,000 years. I mean, so much more so than what the Masoretic text allows. But the concept, the basic concept, is the same. So don't get discouraged when you see this, but just realize that the Hebrew text may provide the original version that became corrupt by other cultures. So it was that's in my talk. It's short, sweet, but I just wanted to provide you with something that you could walk away with and apply to your everyday life. Yeah. Anyways, any questions? I'm open for questions, comments. Yes, I do have books for sale. This is 16 years worth of research. And what Volume 1 does is just kind of go through Hebrew concepts, the cogency between archaeology. You know, there's the arguments that you will hear from scholars like Israel Finkelstein that when you look at archaeology, it totally contradicts the... I use a lot of his research to show that, well, that's not actually the case. Go ahead, James.
I just had a comment that I'll stand where I wanted. Okay. Yeah, a comment that I'm so glad that Jodell is emphasizing these children of Abraham. I'd mentioned it in passing. You've been working hard on it because there's this thing circulating. I think it tends to be in certain Jewish circles where you call Rome Edom and you do all of this stuff. And you can say whatever you want about Esau, but everybody seems to ignore Genesis 36. And I think David read it, and I read it, and now you're doing it. David Tyler did it too, as I recall. And first of all, great nation is used. He also will be a great nation, and I will bless him. Now, you say, well, it doesn't say he'll be a light to the nations or anything like that. Well, you know, and remember when the Israelites are passing through the land, particularly the sons of Lot, Moab, and Ammon, and Esau even, it's not like there wasn't any friction, but the point is these are protected areas that had been given to them. And then Abraham sent his children further, we think, like into the Sinai Peninsula, to separate everybody. But there is a kind of a separation in the Middle East, and theoretically people could follow that today and somewhat get along. In other words, there could be children of Abraham in the Arabian Peninsula, and that would be their place, and then there'd be people on the East Bank, and that would be their place. And then there'd be people on the West Bank, and that would be their place. And they could kind of be like kissing, spitting cousins. If you've ever been to a family reunion, and you had a big family like my father's family, I loved our family reunions, but fights break out, misunderstandings. Sometimes people get up at a meal and slam a plate down. I don't know if your family was like that. And other times everybody's hugging and crying, and this is just family. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And I had something else.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Well, and I think one of the greatest evidences as well, the world's three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the religions that have made the greatest impact in our known history, who do they all claim as their father? Abraham. So this is another evidence. The other thing to point out, and I forgot to mention this earlier, is that when Israel comes out of Egypt, here you have Balak hire Balaam to curse Israel. But here you have a pagan prophet, and what does he do? He obeys Jehovah. He says, I cannot go beyond. I cannot curse that which is blessed. So I think that sometimes when we read the text, we have to be a little bit more open-minded without thinking that everybody and his brother is always pagan. You can find there's some truth in Egyptian text mythology. There's a little bit of truth and there's a lot of error, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
So I had one more thing, just a clarification. This quote at the bottom of the Job sheet, I see at the end it mentions the Septuagint. I just tried to look this up. I wasn't clear on that. But
Yeah.
it starts out, this man is described, and I don't see quotation marks. So what's from the Septuagint and what is from something else?
So that very last verse, that very last verse is, they render it as Job 18. It was obviously a colophon that was added to the original text.
And what's the last verse?
18.
And his friends? I mean, there's no quotes, so I can't.
Yeah, it should be in quotes because that is a direct quote from the Septuagint.
Which part?
In verse 18, where it says, this man is described in the Syriac book, all of that is from the Septuagint, beginning with verse 18.
You're saying the whole thing is
The whole thing.
but it's a marginal note in some versions of the Septuagint?
Well,
I've never seen this man is described in the Syriac book. I've never seen the Septuagint.
yeah, it's in Brenton's Septuagint. It's just as a continuation of chapter 42, and it just continues on in verse 18. So, yeah. So, any other questions, comments?
Sounds like a footnote.
It does sound like a footnote. Yeah, it does.
Do you have any comments on the fact that Shem and Melchizedek may be one and the same?
This is just me. Oh, okay. So Chuck's question is whether or not Shem and Melchizedek would be the same person. From my perspective, I see them as different people. I think we get into this myopic view that anybody mentioned in Scripture that is deemed righteous has to be somebody. Rather than just saying there were actually lots of righteous people. When you look at Abraham's interactions with King Abimelech, he's actually a pretty righteous dude. I mean, and even Shechem, the men of Shechem, they seem, pretty good too. Yeah, better than Jacob's two sons, that's for sure. The other thing with Melchizedek is that when you follow his genealogy, you find that his sons are ruling under the dynastic name of Zedek, like generations later when David comes on the scene. So you find it's a ruling dynasty in that, in that Jebusite area. So for me, I don't find that they are one and the same. Now, it is interesting that, here we have these patriarchs living through all this history, Babel, all of this, and you hear nothing of them. So the question is, why is history silent? Yes?
Hi, does the great presentation, does the geography support this? Were they all living within
Are you talking about Job?
No, more like Noah, Abraham.
Well, and that's the question. So, where you have the least amount of evidence, you have the greatest number of theories, and I found that's where people become the most passionate about their theories that have the least amount of evidence. So, what I find, my approach is to say that there are 5 or 6 possibilities, and maybe logically we can deduct that this has the greatest, evidence. The only thing that we have, it landed in Mount Ararat. They went into a plane. They would not. God wanted them to spread abroad across the face of the earth, and they refused. They like being around each other. I mean, look at the early American pioneers where they're cart and horse, and they're setting off to no man's land, and we don't have exactly lions here in the United States that we have to contend with. So, so they wanted to stick together, and that's the only information that we have. The only other thing that we can do is create all these theories, but they're not necessarily supported by the text. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I'm interested in the genealogy from Abraham and how these people relate with the Israelites. And now your other book actually goes into other sources so that we can, because I've done all the genealogy I can find from the Bible,
Right.
but I still can't figure out who these people were from the other Edomites and, these other countries.
Right. Well, you find Seir was part of the Canaanites, part of the Amorites, and all of those nations that Abraham's children are supposed to dispossess out of the land. So what you find is that, Edom in the south is given to Esau. Midian is also there in the south, Moab. So you have all these different families that are given these different territories. And even to this day, the Druze claim Midian as a descendant. They're a branch within Islam, but they still recognize Midian as being their forefather. So it's amazing how these traditions are handed down. You can't prove them, but they are traditions that certain groups of people hold on to. Yes, Nehemiah.
Yeah, so you mentioned something really interesting, that you never thought of Shem as living in the same era as the forefathers.
Here,
And,
come.
no, that's fine.
Okay.
So, I grew up with rabbinical traditions, and we were taught that Jacob went to study at the yeshiva of Shem and Ever.
Oh, yeah.
Before he went to Laban. So,
That's how they knew the oral Torah.
Well, no, I mean, so they're making up stories,
Yeah,
but the stories are based on somebody sat down and crunched the numbers the way
That's
you
right.
did, and said, oh, wait a minute, they're contemporaries. They were all friends in the superhero club.
Right. Well, and exactly. And you have, but again, what you have is making a story larger than life. You add to it to give it greater validity. And it is, the biblical text is very myopic, because you have all this history surrounding all these things going on in the left field and the right field and the outfield. And the only thing that the story tells you about is that pitcher and the batter. You're not told about all this other thing that's going around. So for me, when you see the interconnectivity, you see the relationships, it brings it to life and makes it real. But yeah, the yeshiva thing is, we can't say yes or no.
So can I talk loud enough, or do I need to go up there? I didn't want to stand up. Because you're the speaker, not me. I was going to say, 4 years ago when Yaakov Walker spoke here, I think it was 4, probably, one of the things he emphasized, which I'd never thought much of, and so you got me thinking this, is that we tend to forget that Josephus is taking us back 2,000 years, almost. So suddenly we have a Jew who's exposed to Greco-Roman legends. He writes against Appian, a Greek pagan who's running the Jews down with all kinds of crazy charges as to their real origins from Egypt, anti-Semitic stuff, or anti-Jewish stuff, or anti-Israelite stuff. But also, that the Antiquities is Genesis 1:1 through basically, I guess, Masada. well, no, not Masada. Actually, that would be the Jewish War, but up to Antiochus and a little beyond into the Herodian period. So there you know, jumping 2,000 years doesn't always put you in the safe zone, but if we have a source that actually narrates, you know, events. Now, I know everybody has Whiston, and I understand why, because it's cheap and it's the only English translation. But remember, it was done in the 18th century, and it's really not a real good translation. There are just many, many mistakes in it. Most of Ernest Martin's mistakes, in my opinion, about the location of the temple, second temple, not the first, that's another subject, but claiming that the Antonia was a fortress and so on, are based on using Whiston's mistranslations of the description of the Antonia. So what are you going to use? Well, it's expensive, but not that expensive. Start buying the Loeb versions of the Antiquities. It's, I think, 10 volumes altogether. They're about $20 a volume. You could buy one at a time. Josephus a Month Club. And then you've got the Greek, which maybe you say, well, I don't read Greek, but you've got a really good academic translation with wonderful notes. Now, I don't buy his chronology too much, because I think he's messed up on the Persian period, like most of the Second Temple people. They're leaving out 420 years, so everything gets off. But just think, if you could talk to a Jew, an educated Jew 2,000 years ago, and say, what were you told around the campfire? And not just that, I think he's done a lot of research. So don't forget Josephus. You know, I admit, I go to the wars, I go to antiquities. I'm interested in the period of Herodian period. So I know that stuff. I couldn't even write the Mary book without Josephus. You say, what? Because I think Mary's Hashmonean. So I have to have that, the names and everything. But I'm telling you, Antiquities is just ignored by almost everybody. People don't read Antiquities. We should read it. Here's a Jew telling his whole history of his people, and it's based on the Bible, mainly the Hebrew Bible. So I really encourage you to try the Loeb, L-O-E-B. They're on Amazon. You can get them.
The Loeb is online. So you can just Google Loeb. Yes. Yeah. So the Loeb Classic Library is online. University of Chicago has, I think the system is called Penelope, if I recall, and you can search it through that system. So, the other thing too with Josephus, his chronology, some scholars theorize, is based on another 3rd century chronologist named Demetrius. And now his work is lost to us, but it's preserved in like Espius and Josephus and some of the other early church fathers. So, but yeah, it gets, you know, chronology is really, really boring, and you really, really hate it until it connects the dots and brings it to life. And you see things that are going on at the same time, and for me, I'm blown away by it. So anyways, so I hope this was, yes, Jack?
Well, it becomes important with validity issues like the Exodus. If you have a different chronology, people fight it. You have the 12th century BCE versus the 13th century.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so the Exodus becomes a huge date versus where the evidence is for the dating of the Exodus, because there isn't the evidence in the 12th century. Yes, Nehemiah?
Yeah, so one thing I would warn about is you have the example where Job is identified with Yovav, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a midrashic tendency that ancient Jews never liked an anonymous character. Mm-hmm. So they'd always try to take an anonymous character and identify them with a known character. Like the example is, it says Deborah is the wife of Lapidot. Well, who's Lapidot?
Right.
We never heard of that guy. So then they say, oh, he's Barak, right? Because you can't have this anonymous character. So I would be concerned that that's going on here.
Right, and I agree. It's a valid concern. And so Nehemiah raised the concern that in Jewish tradition, you can't just have a no-name like Melchizedek. Melchizedek has to be somebody. Same thing with Job. Job has to be somebody. So they give him a context with Genesis 36.
So let's said years ago, nobody knows where the land of Uz was. That was the beginning of his lecture. That was at Abilene Christian College when I was 17 years old, and I never forgot that. And that's just how he said it. However, maybe the land of Uz, if you can identify it generally as Edom.
It is. Well, you have Lamentations 4:21.
So that's in the Tanakh itself.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
in the Masoretic text itself. My point is that I think it was in the Septuagint, you're saying?
Yes.
So
Oh, yeah, that colophon sounds crazy.
Well, not just that. Is the Septuagint doing this midrashic thing where it's saying, we got
Right.
this Job guy, we got to identify him as something?
Right. And that's a valid question.
Yeah.
Yeah. For
Just that, I don't think people generally know he's an Edomite.
right. Right. So for me, when I investigated it, I said all these names are so similar. It's hard to deny it. That was
I did not know that quote in Lamentations.
yeah.
Well, the book's not in Hebrew, so, I mean, that,
What, Lamentations?
no, Job.
Right.
Meaning from the middle chapters almost until Elihu, that's not Hebrew.
Right. Well,
That's some other dialect.
and the other thing,
It's pretty hard to translate and read.
right.
You read it, you tried
Not
it.
if you speak Edomite.
Not all of us have that privilege. The other thing to note when you read Job, when you read Isaiah, when you read Ezekiel, especially like the big books, they're not in chronological order. So Job's responses to, say, Eliphaz or to Zophar, they don't necessarily match up. You got to go searching, and it's kind of like a puzzle. You got to put the pieces back together based on context. So what does the accuser say? What does Zophar say? And then go through Job's replies and see where he addresses the same subject matter.
And don't you think the El Shaddai is pretty important?
Yes.
Because we've got it in Numbers as well with Balaam. And it seems to have an archaic feel.
Very archaic. And the other thing that you find as well is that the terminology is just, it's ancient, and it falls out. You don't find later prophets, except for Isaiah, quoting from it that much.
So the Anchor Bible, you probably have. It's Milgram, right?
Yes, it is.
That was his life's work. So that's the first. If I was going to study Job, I think it's 2 volumes. I would start with Milgram. I think that was his whole life. He worked on the language. Jacob
So,
Milgram.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys. Enjoy your lunch. And what time do we need to be back?
2 o'clock, right, Rob?
2 o'clock.